For President Thabo Mbeki is calling for a national dialogue to discuss what he has called forces that are against the national democratic change and have planted these forces within the party and other parts of government, including at SARS and at Eskom. Let's get some political analysis. Professor Dirk Kotzé joining us now on the former president's remarks. Prof, good to have you. Thank you very much for coming on. Do you get a sense of a Thabo Mbeki that is worried about the dominance of the ANC being in jeopardy?
Yes, sir. This interview. Some of them are not so new. Some of them are in the middle of March at a public event. So it's something that we start to think about, especially this notion of a counter-revolutionary process, which to some extent he regards as being supported from within the ANC. And that it refers, for example, to SARS and to Eskom and to Transnet and others. Now, that obviously overlaps with the state capture period and the presidency of President Zuma. So the implications of what he's saying in this respect is very serious. And it means that there is, in a sense, a very deep sort of difference within the ANC, and he regards that as it started already before 1994. So this is, in a sense, some would say, a very comprehensive or elaborate conspiracy theory within the ANC, and that it's possibly is meant to discredit the period of his presidency and that of President Mandela, and that it also explains why what happened during President Mbeki's time as president is, in a sense, almost sanitized, if I can use this term, or justified. So it's a very comprehensive analysis that is providing with many implications, political implications, because he never really spoke about President Ramaphosa and where he stands with respect to the leadership of President Ramaphosa. And I think this is the one point which I think it's still necessary that we understand where does he position himself now, since the end of President Zuma's period, and the fact that he became so outspoken against President Zuma since he became associated with MK. At the UNISA event, he was as outspoken as I've never heard him before, in such severe, outspoken terms.
What are the rival parties then to do of this, as you say, sanitizing of the ANC? Maybe not even the whole party, but at least his administration. For example, to the what we know, of course, from the Commission of Inquiry, that there was a hollowing out of particular institutions like SARS, the Newzroom Commission, also revealing that to a larger degree. And of course, we also saw a parliamentary inquiry that also showed us some of the things that were happening at Eskom. So for him to say this, of course, can then be blamed entirely on these forces that are against the national democratic revolution. How do political parties respond to this?
Well, I haven't heard explicitly how the different political parties responded to it. I think they see it very much as an internal ANC sort of analysis or understanding of specifically President Mbeki. The way in which he presents it is not repeated by many others. It's not endorsed by many others as if it is a sort of a more of an official position that starts to develop. For example, President Ramaphosa has never presented it in the same terms as what we've heard tonight again. So I think that it's very much, I think, vintage President Mbeki, where he very often has his own interpretations, but that it is not sort of embraced by the rest of the ANC as something which they use in their day-to-day political exchanges or political relations with other parties. So in that sense, I think it is something which, I wonder to a large extent what members of the NEC, of the ANC, will say about this, because it creates a degree of suspicion that who are the persons that he not mentioned tonight, but regard as inherently undermining the ANC. He referred to the idea that there is a renewal within the ANC since 2017, or decisions being taken with respect to that. He referred to the Integrity Commission as an example of this renewal process. But at the same time, he also said that it did not really get off the ground so far. So it means that the implication is that a lot of the people that he regard as undermining the ANC from within are still within the ANC. And that is very detrimental for a rebuilding process of the ANC and creates a lot of internal suspicion. We know that many people in the ANC are prone to the idea of conspiracy theories. Whether it is about coming from the time when they were in exile and regarded many people as working for the apartheid government or regime or security police and others, or whether now more likely persons are involved in working on behalf of the so-called West. So these are all typical aspects that are part of the internal thinking process of many people within the ANC.
Let's stay with that a little bit more. I mean, as you're saying, the President Cyril Ramaphosa doesn't, I suppose, characterize the challenges that are faced by state-owned entities, Transnet, Eskom, and so forth in those many words. However, the former president, quick to say that his suggestion of a national dialogue led by foundations was readily accepted by President Cyril Ramaphosa, who immediately came out with a statement to say he thinks it would be a good idea. It's pretty much like President Ramaphosa to accept any program that speaks of, I suppose, consensus building and sitting down around the table, what others call a talk show.
Yes, I think it fits very well within the thinking processes of President Ramaphosa. He, for example, talked about the idea of a social compact, which was now more specifically with more in the field of economic and industrial development in South Africa, and between the private and the public partnerships that should be developed. But I think, given the fact that he himself was one of the key persons in the early 90s negotiation process, the idea of dialogue and negotiations is something that he is very much attracted to. And although he didn't sort of endorse the idea of a national dialogue, as far as I can remember, in very explicit terms before this latest development, because this is an idea of President Mbeki and others that go back quite some time. It's not an idea that he raised now. It is since he left the office of the president, he raised it a number of times, especially during the times when the ANC and government was really in deep trouble. So this is something which I think will fit President Ramaphosa also. He is different from previous presidents like President Zuma, and to a large extent President Mbeki, when he was president, they were not so much in favor of this idea. They were, because there was also talks about, or a bit of a debate about the notion of an economic CODESA. And I can remember that the ANC, for example, rejected it because they said economic policy is the responsibility of the government, and the government must take the decisions about this. So I think the sentiment is changing about this, and a more broad-based public dialogue process is becoming more attractive for them.
Yeah. Considering registered voters, if I'm correct, at about 42% of them are in the ages 18 to 34. Afrobarometer's report lately pointing out that the biggest concern for that demographic that is also going to vote is 70% of them are worried about jobs, 71%, but 26% of them are worried about electricity, and the rest worried about crime, those being the three top issues. Do you think that demographic that is going to vote cares about the Mbeki effect and his conspiracies about what is wrong with South Africa today?
Well, I think the ANC has a slight problem with that demographic portion of our society. I think the the people who are most critical of the ANC are exactly the younger persons. That's why we are also why we are seeing that, for example, they are going more to parties like the EFF, and that the ANC's younger component has declined over time. For example, the prominence of the ANC Youth League is only now being revived. For more than 10 years, there was almost no youth league. So I think what we are seeing is that the ANC ultimately understands now that their survival or their way forward depends even more than in the past on the young voters. And I think, therefore, they are presenting programs like, for example, national health insurance for persons who are not employed. It might be attractive for them. For the middle class, it's not black and white. It is not necessarily so attractive. Um, the idea about the social welfare and the increasing of social welfare or having a minimum wage, for example, are also aspects that they have paid much more attention to than in earlier years. So I think there is an understanding within the ANC that in the past they didn't have to rely so much on simply on the younger generation, but now it has become absolutely important for them to compete effectively and attract attention there. But I'm not sure if what we are seeing lately is still within time for the ANC. Uh, to change the perspective of voters on these matters takes a lot of time. And it depends also on the building of trust that especially the young generation must trust the party in principle, the government party or the party they want to support. And that is something which you cannot do in an election campaign, build that trust. It's a much more longer term process. And I think this is where some of the parties started too late in order to do that.
The outcome of a coalition government, something that the former president says, well, it's something that would have to be decided by the politicians of the day to come in. Doesn't believe that there should be a document that outlines it. It doesn't say it's necessary, but the politicians that come in would need to discuss it. It's vastly different as opposed to the language of the ANC. In fact, I was listening to one interview where they say there is no appetite in the voters in South Africa for a cocktail of political parties governing the country because of the messes that you could talk about, for example, in Tshwane and in other governments where coalitions didn't quite work. What do you make of how the former president thinks of the future of coalitions?
Well, I think he shows quite a realistic perspective on this compared to the ANC, who's in election mode. So they can't really concede that they think about coalitions, because that will be a concession that they have already accepted, that there will be coalitions and that they won't have a 50% plus one or more support base. And that will be, in a sense, a very pessimistic approach by the ANC. So they might present to the public their best case scenario. But I think within the ANC, there's realism behind the scenes that this is what is more or less the future for them. And they have to work on that. And that is why there was so much talk within the ANC by people like David Makura and others about how to plan for coalitions. And that is why there's some legislation but although it is applicable to local government, that deals, for example, with motions of no confidence. There's talks about the possibility of a minimum threshold. President Mbeki also referred to that idea of a minimum threshold as a possible way to structure parliament in future. But I think what he was against is the idea to regulate, for example, the negotiation process in order to establish a coalition, which I think is actually correct. I have seen it in a different context, for example, at my university in Nisa, where the students were involved in determining the election rules for SRC's elections. and what happens thereafter. And the problem always is that the bigger party tries to formulate it in such a way that it suits themselves. So it means that politicians are actually there judging their own rules of how they are, the rules of the game will be when a coalition is formed. And that's not a good approach, because that will mean that the bigger parties will always have more influence in that than the smaller parties. So the playing field is not even for that. So I think let's see how this, after this election, what's going to happen. But the one thing I think we must stress is that though coalitions have a bad reputation in South Africa, there are many good examples. There are many success stories that do not necessarily receive the attention, the public attention. Some of them in smaller places, some of them where there's a success in terms of the parties of a very wide differences that could work together. At the same time, what we've seen in the metros, which is most of the time in the news where there are problems, I think all the parties will acknowledge that they've learned a lot about how coalitions work. And all the parties that will become involved maybe in a national coalition talks and the provincial coalition talks have already served in coalitions at metro level. So it's not as if it is going to go into sort of virgin territory where we haven't been before.
Prof, appreciate your time. Thank you very much for your analysis.